So for Assessment 2 of Innovative Pedagogies, we're going to look at the history of the constraints-led approach and theories which underpin it, its application within the environmental design principles and the human movement framework, and then that application within a coaching context. But first, let's look at traditional pedagogies. Throughout the 20th century, the discourse was of a behaviourist style of coaching, as opposed to a constructivist style of coaching that we'd see within a constraints-led approach. Numerous theories on human development had a linear pedagogy, and we would see drills like in Figure 1 being used where there's high repetition and opposed practice. There was a conceptualization of applying a mechanistic view to the human body, such as the brain being the body's computer, with traditional pedagogic methods being heavily reliant upon the expertise of past generations. We saw a habitus being created in sports coaching, with a regurgitation of what has been taught before and coaches not being empowered to try new methods. So if we start to look at the formation of the constraints-led approach, within ecological dynamics, Kaufman 1993 explains how its origins actually examined weather systems and animal movement patterns, where there's an interaction between components of systems. Newell 1986 started to apply this to a sporting context, and saw that each individual is a unique dynamical system compiled of smaller neurobiological subsystems. Kelso in 1995 and Shaw and Turvey's 1999 study showed that these small neurobiological subsystems, such as muscles, joints, work together to provide a coordinated response, and that this response will depend on the athlete's perception of the unstable, ever-changing environment around them. What we'd expect is that as exposure to these environments continue, that these subsystems will become more attuned to the context and be able to provide a more economical, functional movement solution. So within Newell's work on ecological dynamics, he created the model of constraints in 1986. Influenced by a number of scientific subdisciplines such as ecological psychology and complexity sciences, the model of constraints highlights the interaction of the task, environment, and organism or athlete to produce a perception-action coupling, resulting in a physical performance. Therefore, the learning for this athlete is going to be shaped by their interaction with the task they are completing and the environment that they are completing it in, and their intentions, perceptions, and actions all combine to produce a movement solution or physical performance which is unique to that individual. So the constraints-led approach recognises ecological dynamics as being of fundamental importance to its approach. The constraints-led approach utilises Newell's model of constraints and will look to constrain one of the three dynamics that he listed, be that task, environment, or organism, in order to afford outcomes which are relevant to the development area. The constraints-led approach will look to promote an individual to solve task problems or make specific adaptations, allowing the individual to find a solution to a problem in their own way. Therefore, it is important that a coach constrains to afford exploration and creation of solutions, as opposed to constraining to constrain, where there's a risk that an individual will be passively given information and actually be told the solution instead of finding it themselves. This exploration, however, can be supported by the provision of relevant information at appropriate intervals, and would give that relatedness that we see within Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory. Constraints can be both detrimental and functional to the ability to adapt and exploit as well, with the consideration of appropriateness key to a positive learning experience and not over-constraining to actually hinder that development. So when we compare the constraints-led approach to the traditional pedagogies that we saw at the start, we can see that it adopts a non-linear pedagogy because it facilitates the development of skill acquisition for a group at different levels of performance as they learn to adapt and look at their movement solutions. This does mean that an individual may plateau or advance at quicker speeds than others, and athletes will go through periods of stability and instability, reflected in varying levels of competence or the ability to adapt as they develop at their own unique rate. Renshaw, Chow, Davids, and Hammond's review of literature highlighted how utilising a constraints-led approach created a non-linear development by replicating environments that are true to real match situations, something that we can see within representative learning design, which we'll touch upon later on. So we know within the constraints-led approach there's three dynamics we can look to constrain: the organism, task, and environment. Firstly, focusing on the organism. By constraining the organism or individual, we're going to look to manage the movement affordances provided to it. So the constraints-led approach will promote self-organisation, with any coordinated movement pattern being a byproduct of the organism's degrees of freedom, which we'll touch upon further in the human movement framework, and its interaction with the task and environment. Research shows us that experts will actually have greater variability in movement solutions compared to novices, However, traditional pedagogic methods tend to focus on teaching the perfect technique to become an expert at a certain movement pattern, despite this awareness of an individual's degrees of freedom. Therefore, being prescriptive in the teaching of technique or movement patterns may actually be counterproductive to the athlete's development, which was highlighted by Brymer and Renshaw in 2010. And at the bottom here, we can see some constraints that may be applied to the organism. So moving on to constraining the environment. Environmental constraints attempt to manipulate an individual's surroundings in order to afford an outcome. An appropriate environment will be dictated by the development need of the individual, ensuring that the constraints aren't too tough and therefore counterproductive. Renshaw et al. 2019 also highlight that the design of the environment needs to be representative of the context in which they would appear in a match, which links us back to representative learning design, which we'll look at shortly. Interestingly, the coach is seen as an environmental constraint, meaning that coaching behaviour and philosophy are able to affect the perception-action coupling. With a constraint-led approach being an athlete-centred environment, it lends itself to adopting a servant leadership style, highlighted by Minjung, Yukium, Doyeon 2018. Below we can also see some other constraints that can be applied to the environment. Finally, we'll look at constraining the task. Task constraints focus on the goal of the practice, the rules of the practice, and the equipment used during the practice. Brymer and Renshaw highlight how this is seen as the easiest dynamic to constrain due to being able to change the rules or equipment, etc. with relative ease. However, these small task changes can lead to big changes in athlete behaviour, with Buzzard, Farrow, Reed and Masters in 2014, finding that the scaling of equipment was very effective in the adaptation of children, particularly novices. Because of this, there is a potential over-reliance on constraining the task to manipulate affordances. However, below we can see some of the constraints that could be applied to the task. Another comparison can be made between traditional pedagogic methods and a constraints-led approach when we look at coaching for learning versus coaching for performance. In Ashraf's 2017 study, two groups attempted to learn basic football skills for 2 months. The group who completed variable practice, which could be attached to the constraints-led approach, had a higher retention of the football skills and could perform them to a higher standard compared to those who practiced through block practice, which could be attached to traditional pedagogic methods. Even in sports where the skills may be relatively close, such as the triple jump, highly controlled drills prove less effective than dynamic practice, which was representative of reality. However, Shea and Morgan's study did show that athletes who engaged in block practice saw a quicker increase in performance despite the poor long-term retention. This links into contextual interference, where variable practice is helping to support skill learning and retention, compared to block practice, which supports immediate performance improvements with poor retention, which is something we need to consider when looking at our session intentions and what we're trying to develop within our practice session. So now we've looked at coaching for learning, we can look to understand the development within that learning process. Traditional skill acquisition models such as Dreyfus and Dreyfus have a linear progression of skill, which also conflicts with a constraints-led approach. Therefore, Renshaw and Chow created a skill adaptation continuum adapted from Newell in 1985, which is more appropriate to the constraints-led approach. It adopts a two-phase process from coordination to adaptation. However, we can break that down further, with the athlete going from searching to exploring to adapting to exploiting. As opposed to focusing on development on the ability to complete a skill, Renshaw and Chow looked at an individual's perception-action coupling. The stages represent the athlete's interaction with their current context, which has been created through a constraints-led approach. Having understood what development looks like with the constraints-led approach, there are some challenges in assessing it. With a constraints-led approach adopting a non-linear pedagogical approach, the traditional method of observing a closed skill and repetition to assess competency is actually inappropriate. Davis et al. 2013 highlight the challenges in assessing performance, suggesting there should be a focus on developing expertise as opposed to assessing performance at specific points. With Renshaw et al. 2019 stressing the importance of understanding what the image of success will look like prior to the session. This is known as session intention and is one of the environmental design principles that we'll look at shortly. This can be in the form of what is seen, what the athlete says, or how the athlete feels. Davis et al. 2013 promote the use of questioning to support any of the observations made, in order to understand the athlete's perception, action, and subsequent movement solution. A framework was designed by Renshaw et al. In 2019 to apply the theoretical underpinnings of the constraints-led approach into the practice environment with 4 key principles, known as the environmental design principles. The first of these is session intention, and this involves understanding the aims of the session prior to delivery, whilst understanding the needs of the athlete to ensure that the session has clarity and a clear focus. This links us back to understanding the athlete development slide that we spoke about earlier. The second one being constrained to afford. This ensures that the constraints afford opportunities as opposed to preventing them, known as constraining to constrain. And similarly, not to constrain to force an opportunity, but to invite exploration into a desired area, which could be seen as guided discovery on Mostyn's spectrum. The third one being representative learning design. This is developed from the theory of representative design by Brunswick in 1955, ensuring that the practice environment is representative of the match environment. We can simplify tasks as opposed to removing them, as well as preventing constraint decay in that design, ensuring that there's a perception-action coupling happening throughout that practice which is relevant to the athlete. It highlights how ecological dynamics can be used with the constraint-led approach to ensure that the development goal is created in an environment that is representative of the sport, and the information provided by the practice environment is key to developing an appropriate perception-action coupling that can be transferred across. The fourth and final one is repetition without repetition, and this also refers back to a previous theory, being Bernstein's 1967 work on degrees of freedom. It showed us that it is impossible to exactly replicate a movement, even in a blocked practice environment, but that links back to contextual interference. Repetition without repetition ensures there is the opportunity to repeat a movement solution, but within different situations, with the coach managing the variability of the movement solution to suit the athlete's abilities and make sure there's a bespoke level of chaos which is productive. Before we look at these environmental design principles in action, let's first look at the context in which shall be applied. So the session observer was a rugby union coach who's currently with an under-17 age group and has been with the same group of players for 6 years. They train once a week and play once a week, with mixed ability. However, the vast majority sit between the adaptation and exploitation phase of development, looking at Renshaw and Chow's adaptation model. Passos, Arujo, Davis and Shutterworth research into the constraints-led approach within rugby union highlighted the importance of variability within practice due to its dynamic nature, obviously lending itself to a constraints-led approach. So let's look at the first of the environmental design principles in practice, being session intention. A clear primary goal was established, which was to develop the perception-action coupling for attack when they have an overlap. The current ability of players has been considered as per Renshaw et al. 2019 statement, as there was a strong understanding of the players as the coach had been with them for 6 years. The idea was to challenge their skill adaptation process, attempting to move it into the exploitation phase. And as coaching here was for learning as opposed to performance, variable practice was deemed appropriate. Development into the exploitation phase may be challenging as per contextual interference because of the development rate being slow. However, the timing of the session was factored in, be it pre-season, and therefore coaching for learning was also appropriate in this circumstance. Due to the fact that we were coaching for learning, the session focused on providing the players with opportunities to explore solutions as opposed to being potentially directed to them or told them. And questioning was used to understand the perception-action coupling to support any observations made. Due to the fact that questioning was used, and the session focused on task as opposed to outcome, we can see elements of achievement goal theory come in here from Nichols in 1984. And the questioning was used to inform the constraints to help create an autonomy supportive environment as per Majot and Vallerand 2003, helping to develop relatedness within self-determination theory to enhance intrinsic motivations as per Decci and Ryan 1995. Moving on to the second environmental design principle, constraining to afford. Both task and environment were constrained to afford overlaps in attack, such as number of players, rules, pitch size, and the mentality of the opposition. This invited a perception-action coupling in a desired context, referring back to the earlier mentioned session intention. Constraints are repositioned, preventing constraint decay, and the constraints ensured the afforded opportunities were relevant to development need and development level. The environment not only offered the affordances, but promoted exploration into it, again looking at this guided discovery, with players seeing an enhancement of competency both technically and technically to enhance intrinsic motivation as per Decci and Ryan 1995. And if we look at figure 6, we can see that adaptation into that exploitation of affordances. Moving on to the third element of the environmental design principles being representative learning design. Affordances were provided in a practice area representative of the performance environment. Therefore, pads weren't used as artificial defenders, and cones were used to mark out the playing environment as opposed to being made to run around, etc. Participants were required to self-organise, supporting the interaction of the neurobiological subsystems, such as muscles, to interact to provide a coordinated response in an environment representative of a rugby union match. This ensured that the perception-action coupling and movement solutions in the practice environment could be transferred into the performance environment. An example where this isn't the case is with Renshaw, Oldham, Davis and Goals in 2007. where they discovered that batsmen in cricket would have a different movement solution to a bowling machine compared to a human bowler, meaning if a bowling machine was used for practice, it would not be a transferable movement solution into the performance environment. Also, there wasn't a search for the perfect action. Instead, we looked for an effective perception-action coupling to provide an appropriate movement solution to the context. This supports coaching for learning as opposed to coaching for performance. However, as this was in the pre-season, as per the session intentions, this was deemed appropriate. And then finally, we have repetition without repetition. So variability was managed to provide an appropriate level of instability for players' abilities, managing the chaos to promote adaptation and prevent over-arousal. Harwood, Sprague, Keegan 2008 and Kanian 2015 stipulates how over-arousal can cause somatic and cognitive reactions such as anxiety, which can inhibit motor learning and negatively affect performance. We facilitated the exploration of different movement solutions, achieving a similar outcome, that exploitation of affordance, but in different ways, not looking for that perfect technique as aforementioned. This allows self-organisation and problem solving within a constraints-led construct. Moving on to the human movement framework, something that we looked at within constraining the organism briefly. Degrees of freedom was a concept developed by Bernstein in 1967 and looked at how all dynamic subsystems, acknowledged from the ecological dynamics such as muscles, can work together to produce an organised movement solution. Within the organisation process, there will be movement anchors and individual variability, and that practice is used to help the development of the unique organisation process. Using the movement anchors, it is possible to identify potential errors in the movement solution. However, as mentioned in Constraining the Organism slide, being prescriptive in the teaching of technique or movement may be counterproductive to development. And we also know from the research by Brisson and Allan 1996, Davids et al. 2008, and Renshaw and Davis 2004, that experts will have greater variability in movement solutions compared to novices. And that if we were to over-deconstruct a movement and practice them out of context, it prevents the perception-action coupling process, which is key within the constraint-set approach. Breakouts within a session provide a good opportunity to utilise the human movement framework. While still using the environmental design principles, we're reducing chaos to focus on the movement solution as per Renshaw et al. 2019. Figure 9 gives an example of this, where players are expected to catch and pass the ball along the line whilst taking the ball forward. However, they are only one step away from a fence and therefore need to do it within a smaller confine of space. We're limiting the degrees of freedom by constraining the task on an organism as per Bernstein 1967, focusing on movement anchors of catching and passing, whilst allowing each individual to self-organise a unique movement solution to get that ball along the line, creating a dexterity in performance. So we've seen how the environmental design principles and the human movement framework can be used within a context. Reflecting on this, utilising Gibbs' reflective cycle, and referring back to the session observed in Assessment 001. In this context, we can see small-sided games being employed to prevent the hiding of players within practice, which was observed in the first assessment. Relatedness was also focused on within self-determination theory, and was built into the session intention, such as using questioning. This questioning was also used to support observable improvements in player perception-action coupling and movement solutions, as opposed just to relying on observations in order to progress sessions. However, there are further developments and progressions on reflection from this session. Elements of constraint decay were observed. This could have been addressed by increasing the variability to increase the levels of chaos as the players adapted and exploited the affordances created. An individual questioning could have been used more often during the practice, as opposed to the group questioning. This is to check the understanding in the perception-action coupling of all involved as to potentially one prominent player within the group.